Welcome to The Wing, the emotional and financial health check you never knew you needed. We provide tangible solutions for young women to build emotional health and wealth on their journey from school to motherhood. This is the podcast for young women in Australia navigating the big stuff: life, money, and motherhood. From high school to first homes, babies to bank accounts, we take you on an interactive listening journey that helps you make smart, empowered decisions every step of the way.
Hello, ladies. Welcome to another episode of The Wing. I'm so happy to be recording again. It's been a little minute. We had the birth of our third child, little girl, in October 2025. So I'm recording in Jan as we speak, and it's been a very wild few months, to say the very least. So this episode is going to be a little bit about our experience, or a lot about our experience with the birth of our daughter and what we've been doing the last few months, and some interesting things that came out of a psychology session that I had postpartum that I think might be helpful to some of our listeners. And if it's not you, it might be somebody that you know. So the topic of today is called Disenfranchised Grief. Now, I'm going to try and not cry because it was a very, very emotional experience that we had. So I'll start from the beginning. So we booked in for a planned C-section in October. Had a few complications towards the end of my pregnancy, and that was deemed the safest option. So had the planned Caesar at 37 weeks, and our beautiful little girl was born. She was born completely fine. And, it was just lovely. It was a really great C-section experience compared to my previous one with our son. We had her for about 2 hours, sort of got her into recovery, went down to the postnatal ward at the hospital and just had her in there for a bit. Anyway, she was experiencing some laboured breathing, which is quite common for babies that are born a little earlier than they maybe wanted to be. So there was a little kerfuffle between the nurses and the midwives and the doctors, but eventually they decided to get her up to the NICU. So long story short, she spent 2.5 weeks in the NICU, which for anybody who's experienced that for even a few hours or a day or a week or more, it's a very intense environment. I mean, it's a very calm environment, but it's also very intense and very confronting. The way I explain it is that the NICU is full of sick babies and sad parents. So it's a very interesting environment, and the people that work there, I just take my hat off to, because I just can't believe that they work there every day. My eyes are watering. I don't think it's tears. I think it's just, I think I have too much makeup on. Oh, that's what I'll tell you anyway. So went through all of that. They took her up to the NICU. They put her on a CPAP machine to help regulate her breathing. The levels went a little too high at one stage, and it actually perforated her lung. So from there, it was sort of remedying that, for the next sort of 2.5 weeks. She had multiple drains in and out of her chest. She ended up on a ventilator. We weren't able to touch her or hug her or anything for pretty much that full amount of time. The NICU staff were telling us, they said, look, the closer she gets to the door is the closer it is for her to actually leaving the hospital. So, we're going day by day, hour by hour. We're phone calls, morning and night to the hospital. It was really a game of chances in terms of who we got on the phone at the time. Had some advice as well to pick our favourite nurses and doctors and stick to them, and ask for them on the phone, because they're going to be the ones that are going to be able to, if you cling to someone in the NICU, just do that, because the more comfortable you are, the more comfortable the situation can be. So we did that. It was just a very edgy time, and I don't really know how to explain it other than, it was explained to us that NICU is a roller coaster. So you're going to have days where you go 2 steps forward and 10 steps back, and 5 steps forward and 2 steps back. And it was a really full-on experience. I'm just falling apart as I'm recording this, which is crazy because, I've been to therapy. I went to my psychologist, who flagged with me something interesting, and this is the part I want to share. So my biggest recollection from the experience was, as I was telling everyone what was going on, we had lots of friends and family checking in on us constantly, which was amazing. We sort of came across, I found the hardest part of the NICU was watching the other babies and watching the other parents. There was another day where there was a whole team of people running up the corridor with a stretcher and all of this equipment. And I'm trying to read the label on their shirt. I'm like, where are these people from? Are they going into our room? Like, oh my God. And then one of the nurses stopped us and said, are you okay? And we said, who are these people? What are they doing? And she said, they're going to room 34. And we were like, okay, I was in 32. There was a baby getting airlifted to Sydney, to, a bigger hospital. So it's just like, those are the parts of the story that get me the most. And I try not to remember them too much, because what sort of came out of my psychology session around this was that it's a thing called disenfranchised grief. So, after we got our daughter home from the hospital, those were the things that stuck with me. After her NICU experience for 2.5 weeks, she then got moved to the special care nursery in the same hospital. So again, she was moving closer to the door, so we knew she was coming home, soonish. Anyway, she spent about a week in special care nursery, and then they transported her to a different hospital that was actually closer to home, and it was the less intense special care nursery. So by this stage, she was off all oxygen, support and all of that. The way I look at how all of this happened is, she had laboured breathing. There was intervention to help save her. They saved her, but there was some consequences along the way. And the way I look at it is, it's like if you're giving someone CPR and you break their ribs in the process, it's like, well, you saved their life, but they have an injury, that will heal and that will recover. The injury itself was called a pneumothorax. And one of the doctors said to me, look, if we did a chest x-ray on every baby that was born, 98% of them would have a pneumothorax of some sort. But it's just similar to a hole in the heart, like they close over time. So it's not, these things aren't necessarily permanent, and babies are quite resilient, what I've learned. Yeah, it's just a case of, she was just getting moved around and lots of different tubes and drains and things coming in and out of her for, it was 33 days all up. And, for a lot of parents, that's a really short amount of time, because I know parents that have had kids in NICU for a lot longer than that. Looking at the babies in the room around her, like there was one born at 24 weeks. I couldn't even look at that baby that much, because it was just so tiny, and I just was dealing with my own trauma and grief at the time. So, of course, I'm trying to debunk what was going on with this grief and this trauma. And obviously there were a lot of tears and a lot of unknown for a period of time. I thought my GP actually said to Jake and we went to the GP. I was getting a driving clearance actually, and she said, both of you need to see psychologists independently and work through this, because this is a form of trauma. And our daughter was still in the hospital at this stage, and it was on our radar to make sure that we did see psychologists. I wasn't ready yet. Jake was. He spoke to his resource, who was extremely helpful, and a lot of his trauma and grief and stress was about returning to work, like having to face everyone. And I felt the same in a different way, that I wasn't able to face everyone. Like the story hadn't resolved yet, and we were just going day by day in terms of updates. So the thought of being in a group of people, or being around people, was a bit overwhelming at times. I actually had my best friend drive me to the hospital the week after our daughter was born, because I just felt like I just really needed to be with her, and I really wanted her to come with me to visit and make that trip a little bit lighter. We didn't go every day either. Some days we'd just have to skip completely, and we'd be on the phone, 3 times that day to double check and check where she's up to. But there were some sketchy conversations that would happen, because we'd hear one thing, and then we'd get a phone call, as I had the number saved in my phone, and be like, oh my God, we just spoke to them. What's happened? Like, it was just so volatile. And I'm sure any parent that has been through a NICU or special care experience would completely understand that feeling. Your heart just sinks. You're just like, oh, like what's happened now? Like, and obviously your brain goes to the worst possible place. So sorry, this is a little scattered, but I thought it might be. It's not a straightforward story, unfortunately. And that's just how my brain is kind of recalling these things. But I feel like it's really important to share this, because I just know that there are parents out there that are, just maybe this is relatable, to let you know you're not alone, because when you're in there, you can feel pretty lonely. There was another thing our GP said to us. She said, look, when you're in NICU, everybody in there will be doing everything they can to make you feel like this is normal, to make you feel like this is okay and you are okay and your baby is okay. She said, when you leave the hospital and you get back into your normal life, this is not normal, and this is something that you need to deal with. So this is why I went to my psychologist. She talked to me about disenfranchised grief. So I'm going to read to you the explanation of this. noting this is from Google, so she didn't actually give me any written paperwork on this, but this is the concept. So disenfranchised grief is a type of mourning for a loss that isn't openly acknowledged or socially supported, leaving the bereaved feeling isolated, unsupported, and unable to express their pain publicly. These are some examples. This can happen with non-traditional relationships, like a close friend or an ex-partner, like if they died, for example, or if a relationship is hidden, or viewing situations like it might be a car accident or a friend of a friend in, undergoing major surgery or something where you have grief for the situation, but the situation isn't actually technically happening to you. And that is what I was able to boil down in terms of what this experience actually was for me, because when I was telling the story for people, the main bit I got choked up about, as you heard earlier on this podcast, was it was the other parents and the other babies. It was so close. We were so close to that being our reality, actually not coming home with our baby at all. That bit didn't happen, but we were so close and it really could have. So I'm experiencing disenfranchised grief, which, means that that is socially doesn't make sense for me to feel upset about that situation. It makes sense for me to feel upset about our situation. But now that our daughter is fine and thriving, and as she's been out of hospital now for 8 weeks and she is 3 months old, it's kind of grieving a few things, like grieving the loss of that first month. I mean, the silver lining to that was that we came home and we were getting full night's sleeps, and I actually got to recover properly from the C-section. She was in the best possible care that she could have been. She would have been in danger if she had to come home any sooner. They basically handed over a manual to me and said, when we went to pick her up from the hospital, we're running down the corridor like we're taking our baby, we're never bringing her back here, like this is our baby, she's finally ours. But before we left, they're like, okay, so she feeds every 4 hours, she has this many meals of formula, she sleeps this amount of time during the day at this time, and this time, here are all her nappies, here are all her wipes. There you go. It was like, wow, the other two didn't come with a manual, but the other two didn't also come with this extreme level of worry and trauma in a way. So looking at the silver linings now, what's really the things to remember, and obviously a lot of people were asking me, how's your recovery going? And I thought it actually went the best it's ever gone, because I wasn't coming home to looking after a newborn baby and feeding every couple of hours and being sleep deprived. We had a whole other level of stress in terms of our cortisol was probably at the highest level ever for that 33 days, and certainly in the beginning. When she got whisked away in the first instance, I thought, well, this was a possibility. We knew that this might happen, but we know that, she's upstairs, I'm in the same hospital. That was all very lucky. But, then sort of the days went on. It was night 2 of me and her in hospital, and I'd still not seen her again. They would wheel me up to her room if I asked, but there was one that second night I asked. I said, I may as well go visit her. Can you take me up there? I can't sleep anyway because I'm a bit stressed. And one of the peds doctors came down and she said, oh, sorry, Katey, we can't take you up right now. She's having a procedure. And I lost it, because this is at midnight or 2 a.m. or something. And to watch the doctor rush into me like that and say, basically, stop, do not bring the mother up there right now. That was a lot. Jake was coming home with the other 2 kids each afternoon, so he could do bath, bottle, bed and keep things as consistent as possible for them. And then he'd come and visit me during the day, and we'd interchange with my parents and Jake's mum and the nannies. So we had a lot of support on this end, which was really valuable. But, I'm had to send him a text in the morning, because I was like, at 2 a.m, she's having a procedure, and, I don't know what it is. And then at the same time, I was having a lot of chest pain, which I thought was oxygen, just trapped in my chest cavity, like it happened last time. So they whisked me off for a little x-ray or chest scan, whatever it was. And, so this is all just, it was just full on, and had a couple of really good support people in the hospital with me, actually, really good friends of mine. One of them's a team leader of the midwives in the postnatal ward, and the other one is a midwife, and they were visiting me morning and night. And one of the main things I missed from hospital was seeing them every morning and afternoon, because I thought they came in, they gave me a cuddle, they made sure I had food, they made sure my fridge was stocked, we had a chat. It was just, so many people were working so hard to make it as pleasant as possible for us to, not completely fall apart during this experience. The main thing, I think, with it all was that Jake and I we spent that whole month Jake took pretty much all that time off work, which was sort of unplanned. Like we thought, let's bring the baby home and we'll get back into a routine, sort of ASAP. We've got support with the nannies because the older two aren't in daycare just yet. They will be soon. So we had that support and family support. So we would just find ourselves, we'd just be lost every day. I think we visited every, restaurant and club, not nightclub, like like an RSL during the days and have lunch, and we'd both take our AirPods and we'd voice note our friends and we'd message our friends and we'd do little bits and pieces of work where we could. It took me a few weeks to want to post a Wing podcast episode because I wasn't happy, and I thought I record and post this because I'm happy and because I want to share these stories with other parents and women in a positive way. And I just did not have the headspace to even log on. Like I just couldn't. And I think that's a really common thing. I mean, Jake had many meetings that he could have gone to, but was again, concerned about, fronting people, because a lot of people at this stage knew that our daughter had been born, but, we didn't post anything on social. We didn't, which is obviously a big indicator. So then there was sort of some questions coming up, like, how's it all going? And at the time, for a lot of it, we actually didn't know how it was going. Like we were reliant on the information from the hospital, and one day we'd have a great day and we'd be, bouncing around. We're like, yes, we'd come home and take over from the nannies and we'd set up a picnic in the backyard and have that with our kids. And then the next day or that evening, it'd be a totally different story. And we then had this guilt for celebrating almost. And we're having to ground ourselves constantly and be like, hang on, well, she's still in the hospital. So no, you shouldn't feel happy. It was like our upper limiting belief that, we shouldn't feel happy about this. We shouldn't feel happy at all until she's home. Get our baby home and we'll call it even. So it was a lot, and it was definitely a journey that I wanted to share because I feel like I owe it to everyone who takes the time to listen to this podcast. There's some other parts of the disenfranchised grief that's probably worth covering off on because it doesn't just relate to our situation that I'm explaining. There's a few other things, and I'm going to share them because this might be relevant in one way or another. So here they are. Unrecognised relationships, so the death of a pet, a close friend, a co-worker, or someone from a secret or non-traditional bond. It's a very fair example of disenfranchised grief. Stigmatised losses, so miscarriage, stillbirth, abortion, suicide, drug-related deaths, or loss from AIDS. Situational factors, loss of a job, home, immigration, or even a virtual relationship. These are all examples of disenfranchised grief. Ambiguous loss, so mourning someone who isn't physically dead but is no longer the person they were due to dementia or severe illness. Societal stigma, grief tied to social inequity, ageism, or cultural religious biases that downplay certain losses. Now, the impact on the griever is isolation and loneliness, feeling alone because others don't understand or validate the loss. Whether they do that intentionally or not, it doesn't matter. People may try to understand it when you're going through disenfranchised grief of any kind, but it is not necessary. As I said, it's not, society doesn't necessarily recognize that type of grief. It's not as cut and dry as, you lost a parent or you lost a sibling or you lost a partner. Like those are typically the, like a family member or a close friend. It's believing the grief is too intense or that they shouldn't be mourning. So that's the guilt and shame part. Internal conflict, suppressing emotions because there's no outlet, leading to emotional distress. This is exactly why our GP said to us, go and talk to a psychologist because you're going to get into life and you're going to bury this chapter away and it's going to rear its ugly head in 3, 6, 12, 18 months, when you've got time to reflect. And by then, it's been marinating for a long time. So until you can pull out the details and talk about them, you aren't going to be able to move past it, really. Now, difficulty processing, so lack of rituals like funerals or social support hinders healing. So, if it's something that doesn't involve a funeral, then, there's no close to it. There's no sort of end. I mean, I guess the end for us was in a different form. I got my mum to put together some beautiful gifts and she dropped them off at home and to us, and Jake and I went and did the rounds. So we actually drove to the first hospital and went and saw we had 2 gifts, one for the NICU nurses, one for the postnatal ward, and I'd written a card and I had burst into tears both times when I was handing the gift over. but it was a way of closing the chapter because she was no longer at that hospital. And then once she came home from the second hospital, then I actually took her with me a few weeks later and dropped off a gift for that special care nursery team. And I burst into tears again. I wasn't even feeling emotional either of those days. And it just was triggering so many memories. And for me, that was a way of closing the chapter and thanking the teams for saving our daughter's life. And it's going to be a difficult job for my editor to cut out these bits where I fall apart, but it's probably fine to leave them in because it is an emotional message. And I know that it's, hearing this from me is raw. And that is my goal, to always be raw, to always be honest, and to help people. So if I help one person as a result of this podcast episode, then that's my goal. Help one person every episode. So now, the practical coping strategies of disenfranchised grief. So acknowledge your grief, recognize your loss is real and your feelings are valid, even if others don't see it. Find the support, seek out understanding friends, online communities, or therapists who specialize in loss. That was exactly what I did. I asked my GP for a recommendation on a psychologist that specializes in this type of trauma, and that is why I got so much out of the session and I'm able to share it with you. Create rituals, write unsent letters, create a memorial, or find other personal ways to honour the loss. This actually ticks off on a big topic. So I was encouraged by a family friend to journal. I typically journal anyway. That first week, I could not put pen to paper. I was like, I don't want to remember this. I don't want to journal. What am I going to write? And she had actually experienced a loss of her baby, so I think she's in her 50s. So, she went on to have two other healthy, happy kids who are adults now. But I had no idea about that. I've known this family friend for decades. It's amazing the stories that come out when you go through something like this and who kind of comes out of the woodwork. And she demanded to speak to me on the phone and I wasn't ready. Anyway, I ended up calling her back and I said, look, she said, how are you going? And I used words like, I'm starting to disassociate. I don't know what to think or how to feel. And she said, Katey, if you hold that baby for 5 minutes, 5 hours, 5 days, or 50 years, you be there. Like, be there, journal, write it down. You're never going to regret it. If you don't let yourself process all of this, it's not going to be helpful for you or your family. Anyway, it was the prompt I needed, and it was a very hard truth and some tough love that was pretty intense to receive at the time, but it was some of the most valuable advice that I was given. I started journaling, and a lot of it was documenting what was happening each day. So, I'd write the date, and I think I journaled every day for about 3 weeks while this was all happening, and it ended up evolving into letters, small letters, like small paragraphs to our daughter. And I thought if on the odd chance that she ever wants to read it one day, then it's there. I'm certainly not going to read it to her if she doesn't request it. It was really helpful because I'd flick back a page back, a few days, and I would watch the progress that had happened over that 3-day period. And just kind of like normal journaling, when you write something and then you might flick back a few months and look at what you wrote and think, oh my gosh, I actually have done all of those things, or I have achieved that, or that did change, or I don't feel that way anymore. Like, it's all a positive kind of experience to actually write it down and see what your former self was writing to your future self. So that was something that was really, really valuable, and it is part of the disenfranchised grief trauma. So I'm linking all of these bits together now because I can see what I was going through. I can see how it transpired. I can see what the tools were during the times, like creating those rituals, unsent letters. That's exactly what my journal entries were. I haven't been brave enough to go back and read them yet. Now that since she's been out of hospital, I have had not any kind of inclination that I need to go back and read that. I will let my mind, body and soul decide when the right time to do that is, and it might not be for a very long time. But it doesn't matter because I know that all of those thoughts are out of my head and that they're documented in a healthy way, that I, don't need to think about all the time. And then self-care, prioritizing rest, healthy eating and activities you enjoy to manage emotional and physical well-being. So those were the things that, even reading that now, I think we were doing a lot of that during the time, but it's even more important for us to do that now because we need to show up for our kids and we need to show up for each other. Jake and I have never spent that amount of time together, back to back, day by day. It was funny. It felt like, we'd go to the club and we'd have lunch and it was just us, people on mat leave and a whole bunch of retirees. At the beginning we thought, we could get used to this. And then by the end of it, we were like, I don't think we can ever retire because all we'll do is come to the club every day and play bingo. Oh, but it was nice. It was nice to see a part of life that we don't normally see because we're busy, with kids or work or whatever else. So it was nice to sort of, have that different perspective, and we learn a lot about each other during that time. And one of the really good points actually I will share with you that Jake's psychologist recommended to him, because we were struggling day by day, and she said, why don't you and Katey check in with each other at the beginning of each day, and out of 10 give yourselves a score, like where are you today, how are you feeling today? So often I would say I'm a 4. And then the goal would be, well, what do we need to do today to get you to a 5? So that was the method. And I think that could be valuable in everyday life. I remember sometimes I'd say I'm a 4. Jake said he was an 8. And I'd be like, it's not a competition, but it was a good exercise. So we were able to laugh and, or some days we were much higher than we, closer to 10 than we thought. So it was a really nice tool that we could use to check in with each other. There were some really tough days in there. Like, we'd sort of have to really psych ourselves up to go to the hospital. Some days we were like, yep, let's go. We're ready to visit. Like, let's do it. Other days we'd be dragging our feet getting there, and the saddest thing for me was watching what Jake was going through, because, he'd be in the room for a few minutes. Some days when she was on the ventilator machine, he'd be in there for a few minutes and he'd walk out, and I'd sort of stand there and gather the information, and then I'd go out to the corridor. I'm like, have you had enough? And he's like, yep. So we'd leave. Sometimes we wouldn't stay for any more than 10 minutes. So just being there for each other. There were days when I couldn't cope, and days where I didn't want to go to the hospital at all. And, Jake would go by himself, or he'd take his mum, or we were just sharing the load. And because the kids were looked after at home, it made it a lot easier. We did take them. I think we took them once, but they're so little. It was not a lot of point. It was more to get them out of the house that day. But, just remembering, looking at the kids we did have, and just appreciating them and realizing that for them, nothing had changed. Like, they had sad parents for a month, but they didn't need to know that necessarily. I'm sure they could feel it. And then obviously when we brought our daughter home, there was a lot of joy, a lot of adjustment. There's still a lot of adjustment. Our eldest daughter rarely they're not in daycare, they rarely get sick, and then she gets gastro, and we're trying to protect the baby and and our son from this bug. And then, I think what happened after that? Jake and I got food poisoning because we didn't heat up a meal properly. Jake didn't heat up a meal properly. What else happened? I think there was that. Then into rhinovirus and gastro, which I've just come off the back of. And it was just a whirlwind, obviously, into Christmas and everything. So it was just sort of like, honestly, as I'm recording, this is probably the first day of calm that I feel, which is why I'm recording, because I've got the headspace to do so. But just in retrospect, it's like that was a crazy few months. And now I feel like we are geared for the year. And I'm sure a lot of parents feel that way coming into the end of the year. You've got a lot of competing priorities, and you've got kids starting school, finishing school, starting daycare, finishing daycare, like prepping, for Christmas and New Year, and trying to have downtime, and not wanting to miss out on anything, trying to make the most of everything, but you're exhausted at the same time. And then getting into the new year hoping that you're fresh and you're ready. Then there's obviously lots of change that comes with that with kids. We're about to go into our first little bit of change, which is getting the older 2 into daycare in a couple of weeks' time after some orientation days and whatnot. That's our adjustment for this beginning of the year. And then working out how we balance our time, what support we still have at home. Obviously I will still be looking after our baby around the clock. That's a priority, and that's what I want to do. She's literally sitting next to me on the monitor at the moment as I record this, so it proves it's possible. So I'm going to keep recording, and I'm going to keep doing it. So anyway, enough about me. I hope that was a valuable episode. I hope that was some easy enough listening. I was apologizing to my editor the whole way through this recording because I had to keep stopping to cry and get myself together, so you didn't have to completely listen to a blubbering mess. But yes, this is a very heartfelt episode. It's my most intense episode so far, personally. There was no way I wasn't going to share it, because I think that, as I said, if this helps one person, my job is done. So ladies, thank you so much for listening to this episode. I am probably going to cry again, so I'm going to stop recording. And my next episode will be a little bit more lighthearted and hopefully funny and relatable, but we'll get to that whenever I get to it. All right, ladies, thanks for listening. Catch you on the next episode of The Wing. Bye-bye.
Enjoyed the episode? Hit follow and check out _wingpod Oz on Instagram for a dose of wisdom getting you on the right path to success.